In this lesson, we'll talk about maintaining state in web applications and what ASP.NET 2.0 does for you to manage the state across multiple requests by a single user. But first, we'll talk a little bit more about the page object, as well as several of the important objects that are programmatically available to your applications. In the previous lesson, we talked about the page object, and I said that it was an object that encapsulated a single request and response from a single user for a single page. And that's actually a little bit of a misnomer. It should work as a working definition for right now. But the page gave us access to important information like whether or not the current page request was the original request or whether it was the result of a postback. And then we were able to write code based on that. The static page object contains several other static objects that allow us to programmatically work with all aspects of a user's interaction with our web application. So let's start looking at each of these objects and see what they do and how we can use them within our apps. And we'll be using most of these objects throughout the remainder of these lessons, so consider this just a quick overview of the general features and not a comprehensive explanation of each and every one. So first of all, we'll start off with the request and the response objects. The request really encapsulates all the information about a request from a user's web browser. So whenever they type in http://www.whatever.com/yourpage.aspx, all of that request plus information about the user's browser plus any data that might be transferred along with the request in the HTTP GET or the POST, for example, like form data or query string data, that's all contained and accessible to us in the request object. Now, once our application has an opportunity to manipulate the results and we're going to send information back out to the user, we would use a response object. If you recall from the previous video, we did page.response.write, which allowed us to send just a quick string of information to the web page. So this response object allows us, it encapsulates all the information about what our application will be sending in response to the user's request. Okay, then we also saw the application and session objects in the previous videos, and you recall that the session object encapsulates all the information for a single user's interaction at one period in time with our website, whereas the application object has attributes and methods of the application as a whole. And we were able to use these objects in order to store some stateful information that was saved between requests. And we're going to talk about these more in this lesson as well. Then you have the form object, which is actually very similar to the request object, except it just gives us a subset of the same information. So we're able to get any information that was passed along in the HTTP post for the given request. So we're able to grab off any fields of data that were sent over in just a typical HTTP post. And then there's a trace object that's available, and as we're going to see in the next lesson, this object encapsulates information that we're going to use in order to debug and monitor our application's performance. And then we have an object called the user, and this allows us to provide some security to our application. So each user can have roles that they're associated with, and based on those roles they can have access or be denied access to certain resources on our website. And then there's a server object, and that has information about the web server in general and keeps information about like the path, the file path of our specific application as it runs in the server and things of that nature. And then there's an object that's kind of neat called the previous page object, and this gives us information about the previous page that was served to the user before the current page that our request is currently handling, or that our code is currently handling. And also, I said that each of these objects are accessible through their parent object, the page object, but that's actually a little bit of a misnomer as well, because each of these are accessible without having to type in like page.request or page.response or page.trace. You can just type in request. some property or method or response dot, because there's a implied import statement that's used by our web applications. Okay, so I just wanted you to be aware of these high-level objects because we kind of used them but have glossed over them up to this point. And all of these objects really encapsulate a great deal of functionality that we can draw on as we develop our applications. But let's continue on and now talk about application state. Now, when you used Visual Basic to create Windows Forms applications in the past, you didn't have to worry a lot about the state of the application because the applications that you built started up, then they ran for a few minutes or maybe a few hours at a time, and then when the user shut down the program, it was cleared out from the computer's memory. Now, during the time that the program was running, you may have had a handful of variables that stored important application information like user information and what windows have been opened or what information is loaded into the current application. And those variables were kept alive the entire time that the program was alive, and they were programmatically available for you to retrieve and to change in code. Also, you may have had one or more forms that were visible at all times while the application was running. So there was really this concept, this state that the application was just around and it was alive for long periods of time. You didn't have to worry about retrieving the information every time somebody wanted to make an interaction with your application because the program was persistently in the memory of the computer until you shut the program down. But that's in sharp contrast to the way that you create web applications. Each web page is in a website has no inherent knowledge of any other web page in that same website. You can almost think of each individual web page as an application in and of itself that's only fired off when that page is requested. So each web page that you request from an ASP.NET based website is like a mini application unto itself. It runs for less than a second, like a fraction of a second, and based on the request, or in other words, the information that's coming in, it constructs a response, and that information is then sent back to the web browser. So if each page of a web application is only live for less than a fraction of a second, how do you transfer the important data between web pages? How do you retain variable information like a setting that they used on page 1, some option that they typed in? How do you save it into page 3 or page 4 within your web application? Or in the case where we're performing a postback, how do the controls know to retain their values from post to post? Have you ever thought of that? Now, in the past, had you not used ASP.NET to develop your applications, these were all things that you had to worry about. But once again, ASP.NET does the dirty work, the heavy lifting for you, so you don't have to even think about it most of the time. However, there might be some instances where you need more control or at least some options about how you want to manage the state of your application. So I want to show you a few ways that this is enabled in ASP.NET 2.0. So first, let's talk about view state. And I'm going to create a new project. Whoops, let's cancel that. I apologize. Let's go new website. There we go. And we're going to call this Lesson 04. And click the OK button. And after a moment or two, we'll see our source view. Let's get over to the designer here. And I'm going to drag and drop two text boxes, a button, and then a label control onto our design surface. And let me give these some names because we're going to reference them in code, so I don't want to just leave the default names here. All right. So we'll call this first text box. We'll call this second text box. We'll call this OK button. And we'll call this result label. And let's just go ahead and change that, and we'll change this to just OK. All right, so now we've set ourselves up. I'm going to double click the OK button. And let's just do this real quick. I'm going to do result label.text equals first text box.text, and we'll add in an empty space character, and then we'll put second text box.text. Okay. Let's go ahead and save this. And now let's run our application. And I just want to make a quick point here as we get started. We're going to click OK here. All right, so I'm going to type in here Bob, whoops, and here I'm going to put Tabor, my name, and I'm going to click OK. And notice that it fills in our label control with Bob space Tabor. Okay, I understand, or it's easy to understand rather, how Bob and Tabor got put into this label control that wasn't visible before, but now is visible. But how did we get the values back into these text boxes? All right, let's go ahead and view the source. And I want you to notice that there's something here called view state. So it's a hidden field. Notice type equals hidden. And the name of this field is view state with an ID of view state. And then it has this value, this crazy string. Whoops, let's go here. This crazy string of numbers and letters. Okay, now this is a relatively small view state. But this helps keep track of the values that were placed into the two text boxes. Now this doesn't mean anything to you or I, but ASP.NET is able to look at this string and interpret it and translate it into the values that are in the first text box, the second text box, and the label, and even the OK button. Okay, so it deciphers this and it determines what the values were. And so we would be able then to write an application to test and see, did the text change? Because it was originally Bob, but what does it change to? Okay, so that view state allows us to do several things. First of all, it keeps track of the data that was in each control from postback to postback. Okay, so that's very neat. Now we don't need to know a lot about how view state works, but we can use view state ourselves if there are values that we need to preserve from postback to postback within the same web page. So let's do this. I'm going to go back to our form here. I'm just going to double click to get the page load event handler started for us. And then I'm going to do this. If page.isPostback equals false, whoops, let's get this right here. Then we'll do something like this, viewState.add. And then I'm just going to give this some name. I can call it anything I want to. This is just a key so we can get back to this information. I'm just going to call this viewStateItem. I could have called it Steve, but chose to call it something a little more pertinent to what I was working on. And I'm just associating with that key a value of hello world. Okay. Now, let's go up here to our OK button. And actually what I'll do is just I'm going to comment that line out. I'm going to steal this. And I'm going to go view state, whoops, dot keys viewState.item, and I'm going to pass in the key name, viewStateItem, and let's just do a toString to be on the safe side. Okay. So the first time our page is loaded, it should hit this line of code and save a new value into the view state. And then when we click the OK button, it should retrieve the value from the view state and display it in the result label. Let's try this and see if it works. Okay, seemed to work. We get our hello world, which is what we expect to see. So that's great. Okay, so just to recap quickly, view state is something that the controls on your application take advantage of to store their original values in, so that as pages are posted back and back and back, that the original values can be repopulated, rehydrated from this real crazy looking alphanumeric string that's stored in a hidden form field on the web page for the client. And we also demonstrated how you can put your own values within ViewState so that you can retain information as a page is requested and re-requested by a single user. But let's move on. What if you need to store the state or store information or values across multiple pages for a single user? You can't use ViewState in that case, but there are a couple of ways for you to accomplish this. And one of the best ways to do this is through the use of the session object that we learned about in the previous lesson. Now you recall that the session object encapsulates a series of requests from a single user. Now how does ASP.NET know to keep track of each user? How does it know how many users there are? Well, during the first request by a new user, it stores a temporary cookie on that user's web browser, and with each subsequent request made by that web browser, the web browser sends along a special identifier, and then by that identifier, ASP.NET's runtime engine knows to look up all the sessions that it has currently that's working with, and it finds the session object in its memory, and voila, there you go. You have the information back about that user. So that's pretty neat. It allows you to be able to programmatically get back to any information that was stored within the session object as the user progresses through your website. Okay, so what's the neat thing about the session is that just like we did with the view state, we can add our own values to the session object. So let's do this. We kind of demoed this a little bit in the previous lesson. I just want to reinforce that and make this point once again. I'm going to add a new item. It's going to be a global application class. It's global.asax. And let's do this. Whenever the session starts, we're going to add a new value. So we're going to call this some value. And we're just going to put in that value demonstrating session state. Okay. And then in our default.aspx, let's just do this. Or actually right here we'll do it. Let's comment that out. Go for this again. And this time we'll go okay. And perhaps we should do a toString here as well. Okay. All right, so let's run this application. And I'm going to click the OK button. So you'll see here that we have our little string that was stored in our session as the session was created in the global event handler session_start. So that's where we placed this value. And then we retrieved it whenever we clicked the OK button and handled the OK button click event. Let's do something else just a little more fun. Let's see if we can do this off the top of our head here. So instead of just some value, what I'm going to do is go session dot, let's see, session ID. Okay, so this is going to give us that unique identifier that is normally saved within the user's web browser's cookie. Okay, here, maybe we'll just, yeah, that'll be fine. We'll do that. So now let's see what one of these identifiers look like. Okay, once again, it's a crazy mixture of letters and numbers, but this uniquely identifies my browser session on this web application at this point in time. If I were to hit refresh, I'm going to continue to see the same value. If I were to shut this down and wait for about 30 minutes and then hit the refresh button, I might see a different value here because a new session was probably created for me in memory. Okay, because as you remember from the previous lesson, sessions are discarded after a certain period of time when the web server assumes that the user has stopped visiting pages on this particular website, so the session would then die. Okay, so let's continue on. So just to recap, the difference between the view state and the session is that the view state only works for a single page that has been posted back to itself one or more times, but the session works across multiple pages for a single user. Now, the view state and the session objects work just fine most of the time, but they do have some inherent weaknesses. First of all, neither are strongly typed. So if we were to go back here in the default.aspx.vb and take a look at the code where we access the value session some value, notice that the key that gives us access to that value is a string literal. Same thing is true for the view state. Notice that we have view state item is a string literal. It's a key to grab the value out of the web page that's stored there. Okay, so what happens if we were to spell this some value as we're setting the value into the session object, but we spell it differently accidentally whenever we are accessing or getting the value back out of the session? Well, the compiler's not going to find that. What's going to happen is we're going to be running our application, testing it, or worse, one of our users are using our application, and they're not getting the results that they expect because what's being returned is an empty object. Okay? So this would be difficult for us to track down. What would be better is if we could just go session dot some value. This would not only give us IntelliSense help and some validation that we're using the correct property, but then we'd also gain the value of the code editor and the compiler telling us if we spelled something incorrectly. So it would be nice if this were strongly typed. Secondly, it would be nice if we could have some flexibility in where the values are stored. Currently, as we've noted, the session object stores its values in memory, which could scale pretty badly if we get like a sudden rush of users to our website. Okay? Now this has been improved in ASP.NET 2.0, however, it still can be somewhat of a concern. Also, if we were to try to store a lot of values within our view state, that makes our web page really big, which increases the load time of our web page and the transfer time across the internet. So is there a better way? Well, in ASP.NET 2.0, we have what's called the profile object now, and it has two big benefits. First of all, it's strongly typed, which means that we get the full benefit of any other variable or any other property of an object within our system. And then secondly, we get the flexibility of where we store the values. You can configure this to be stored, for the values to be stored in the database, SQL Server database, Access database, an XML file, in memory, wherever we want to put it. Also, it's easy to set up and use. It really works best for authenticated users, but it also works for unauthenticated users of our website. Now, I'm going to explain what that means later once we introduce membership and the login controls and the functionality that those contain within a couple of lessons from now. But basically, if you don't require a login, you're going to need to use unauthenticated, or rather the anonymous features of the profile object. I'm going to show how to do that right now. So what we'll do is define the properties of our profile object by going to our web.config file. Now, we haven't talked extensively about web.config yet. We're going to talk about that in the next video a little bit more. But I'm going to go ahead and just double-click this file and go to the very bottom, and I'm going to just paste in some code. And hopefully this will make sense. There is an XML file called the web.config that contains the settings for our website. It wanted to place a web.config file whenever we went to go debug our application, and we said yes. So that's how that file got here into our website in the first place. Now what I'm going to do is paste some XML into my web.config file. And first of all, I'm just going to talk through this at a very high level, and so just so you can kind of get the basic understanding, since we're not using any type of membership or login features of our website, we're going to set the anonymous identification enabled equal true. Okay, so let's not worry too much about what that means right now. Just accept it at face value that we're going to use that for our particular example. We're going to enable the profile object and then begin to add properties to that using an add element, setting the properties of the add element, name equal my new property, and then allow anonymous equal true. Okay, we can also set the data type. So if we didn't want it to be a string, which is the default, we could set it to an integer, a double, or whatever the case might be. Okay, so we're just adding one property to this thing called the profile object. That's all we're doing in our web.config. So I'm going to save that. Then I'm going to close that file, and then I'm going to come back over here and comment this out and begin then to work with our new profile object. So here's what we're going to do. Profile dot, and notice whenever I get the IntelliSense, notice that my new property comes up. It shows up under the profile object. How did this work? Well, the profile object looks to the web.config and any properties that we define therein, and it allows us to use those within our application. So I'm going to set my new property equal to some value. I'm just going to call it red. Okay? Now how do I access that property? The exact same way that I do it whenever I'm writing normal code to access a property of an object, right? So I'm going to do this. Result label dot text equals profile dot my new property. That's all there is to it. And this can be stored across multiple pages of our site, okay, or multiple postbacks for the exact same page. So I've run the application to test it, and now I'm going to click the OK button in order to retrieve the value that was set into the profile during the page load. And notice that now we're able to pull that value back out, the value of red, which we place into our label. Very cool. So this is probably now the preferred way to save state within ASP.NET 2.0 applications. Now we haven't shown some of the more complex features where we're able to define where those values are stored, whether in a database, XML file, or whatever the case might be. That's a little more advanced. But for right now, just accept the fact that if you need to save state, use the profile object, and then research it a little bit more on your own if you need some more of the extended functionality. So now let's continue on. Okay, but what if you need to maintain state? Maybe it's some sort of global setting across all users and all pages of your website. Well, as we saw in the previous lesson, the application object can fit the bill for this purpose. Do you recall the previous lesson how we created a poor man's visitor counter? How we incremented, every time a session started, we incremented a special value called user counter, and whenever the session ended, we decremented that and then displayed it in a web page. Now, I'm not going to take the time to redo that example. Just refer back to the previous example, but that was something that worked across all the users of our application, across all the pages that were in our website. They all had access and could make modifications to that application variable, that value that we stored in the application object. But now let's talk about some other ways that we can pass data between two or more pages on our website. And one of the most common ways that you might be familiar with if you're already familiar with web development is to use a query string. So I'm going to use this hyperlink control. And the beauty of the hyperlink control is that it allows us to programmatically change the URL and the text that the given hyperlink control points to. So we could, for example, point ours, and we're just going to hard code it in this case, but we could do this in the code behind and do it dynamically or bind it to a database or whatever the case might be. We're going to data bind it to another page in our application. We don't have another page. So let's go ahead and add one right now, just real quick. So let's select add new item, and we're going to call this page 2, and we'll just click add. Okay. And then on this page, I'm simply going to put a label control. and I'm just going to call this result label. Okay, and let's even just get rid of all the text in here. Okay, so this is my page 2, and this is going to be the target from our hyperlink. But what I want to do in the hyperlink in the navigate URL property is I want to type in page2.aspx. Then I'm going to use the question mark to pass in a value, and we're going to call this value, the name of the value will just be my value, something rather unoriginal. And then the actual value of the values of the name value pair is Bob. Okay, so it's going to pass the word Bob over to page 2, and page 2 can reference that value through a my value tag name. Okay, so over here in the page load, what we'll do is we're going to do request dot form dot my value, and we're going to set that status label dot text equal to. All right, did I not name it that? Let's take a look real quick here. Whoops. Result label. Okay. All right, so let's go ahead and run it now. Okay, let's start with the right page here. And now start it up. I'm going to click the hyperlink. Okay, so let's now talk about some other ways that we can pass data between one or more pages on a website. We can use a more traditional approach of using, for example, the query string. And a query string is just a series of information that's appended to the end of a web page's URL that is used to transfer information. So you have a question mark and then a name value pair. So you might have my value name equals Steve or Jim or Bob or whatever the case might be. Okay, so let's use that technique, and the way we're going to do this is through the use of a hyperlink control. So I'm just going to drag and drop a hyperlink onto our design surface. Now the beauty of using a hyperlink control is that we now have programmatic access to what the text property says of the hyperlink control, so we can change that dynamically, and then also the navigate URL property, which allows us to change dynamically where this hyperlink points to, okay, if we need to do that. Now, just so we have a good target, let's go ahead and add another web page called page 2, and then I'm going to add another page called page 3 while we're at it here. So add new item, page 3, and we'll use this page 3 in just a few moments. But on page 2, what I want to do is come over here, and I'm going to drag and drop a label control. I'm just going to call this result label. Okay, and let's just get rid of the text that's in that label. And now we're going to go back. Oh, actually, I'm going to double click somewhere in the white area on page2.aspx so that I get my page load. Now notice I don't have a code behind. I forgot to check that little checkbox whenever I was adding a new item. But that's okay. We can make this work for right now. So I think I called this result label dot text equals request. So we're going to call the request object, and I'm going to pass in a string, which is the key. So this is some name value pair that I'm expecting to retrieve from the request object. So I should be able to put something like my value in here, dot toString. Whoops, toString. There we go. Okay. So now what we need to do on our default page is, and I'm just going to hard code this property in our property window. We're going to go page2.aspx, and then I'm going to use the question mark. So we're going to start a query string. I'm going to call my value, which is the name of the name value pair, equal to Bob, which is the value of the name value pair. Okay. So now let's run our application, and we're going to click on our hyperlink, And notice that in my URL I have page2.aspx question mark, so the query string starts here, and then my name value pair. The name is called my value, the value equals Bob, and I retrieved that from the request object and displayed it in my label control that I have here on my form. So that worked just fine. So that's one way to transfer information between two pages, to set it within a query string and then retrieve the value of the query string using our request object. But there's actually a second way that we can transfer information from one form to the other. And let's go to page 2 now. Actually, let's go to page 3. So we have our little target label. I'm going to call this result label. I'm going to change the name, the text property, just blank it out. And what I want to do here in the page load is put results label dot text equals request dot form, because we're going to expect some value to be posted to this page, and we'll just call this post back text box. Okay, dot toString. Whoops, toString. There we go. Okay. So now in page 2, what we want to do in our design view, we're going to add a text box and a button. And I'm not going to take the time to rename these. We'll just use them as is for right now. So I'm going to click the, I'm going to actually select the button. Now, what I want to do here is a little bit of a new technique in ASP.NET 2.0, and that is that it gives us the opportunity to post back to a different web page. So typically when I click this button, what's going to happen? It's going to load up the page 2 once again. It's just going to post whatever I type here in this text box back to page 2. But I don't want that to happen. I want this text box to be posted to another page using the regular old HTTP post that's available, even was available 10, 15 years ago in HTTP. So what I'm going to do is set a property of this button, and if you scroll up here, we're going to find the post back URL, and here I can click the little ellipsis button next to this property, and I can select another page within my website that I'm going to post the form data to whenever the user clicks the OK button. Okay, so now all I need to do is, actually I do want to change the name of this to whatever I called this here. So we're going to look for this name, this string called post back text box. That's what I have to name my text box in order for it to be retrieved correctly. So let's go ahead and change this from text box 1 to post back text box. As you can see, I pasted here in the ID. So now everything should work. Whenever I click this button, anything I type in here should be delivered to my page 3, which will then grab it from the request and put it in the result label on my page. So let's go ahead and run this application. And here, let's just comment this line of code out. Let's stop this. I'm just going to comment that out and go forward because that was our previous example. Okay, now we're in business. Okay, so now we're in business. And I'm going to click the button. And it posted whatever I typed in to that text box to page 3. So this is a cross-page postback is what it's referred to as. And it allows us to exchange data between web pages in a more traditional way that we may have been familiar with had you used another technology to build dynamic web pages in the past. Okay, so in this lesson we talked about the page object and some of the objects that belong to the page that encapsulate various aspects of a user's experience on our website. And with those objects, we can programmatically manage the state of our web applications. We talked about state, And we demonstrated various ways of maintaining state on the server, including view state and session objects. And we also talked about some other ways of passing data between web requests, such as the query strings and cross-page postbacks. Now, there's actually some other ways to maintain state that we really didn't talk about, like managing cookies on the client, for example. And ASP.NET 2.0 provides a simple programming interface to manage that, but we're not going to cover that in this particular lesson. But if you enjoyed this video, please visit www.learnvisualstudio.net to download and watch over 400 videos just like this one aimed at all skill levels on many different topics related to C#, Visual Basic, ASP.NET, and a lot more. Thank you.